Over the last, 6 months on the rare earth metal scare, shortage, whatever you want to call it. Dan writes for Real Clear Politics. He is also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, or George Washington University, Public Policy. Sorry about that feedback there. And yesterday he was my compatriot in crime on MSNBC and the Dylan Ratigan Show, which was a lot of fun. Next, I'd like to introduce Jim Lawton. Jim has a really interesting background. I think we're gonna force Jim to wear two hats today. He's obviously from Dun & Bradstreet, as you see on the slide. Very familiar with supply risk management. But I also am going to call on Jim to kind of refer to his manufacturing background. He spent a number of years at HP in the global sourcing environment. And so I think to have him wear both hats today, I think is going to add a lot to the discussion. And finally, I'd like to introduce Dom Gambardella. I know I'd gone out to some of our trade folks, including a colleague of mine, Melissa Stefano, and said, Melissa, I know you're in this customs trade world. Who should we have on this panel? We really want somebody with a really strong customs and trade background, much more tactical, but working with corporations and how to structure their strategies around international trade. And Melissa said, Dom's your guy. So there he is. And with that, we're going to kick off the panel. We're going to transition. I said from the outset we wanted to do something a little bit different. We're not going to do too many slides, I promise, but I found these slides so interesting that we thought we would do just a few. And they are really public opinion surveys. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan.
Thank you, Lisa. And thanks, everybody, for coming here and participating. The first panel was great, very instructive, very interesting. I want to say how unusual it is for me. I'm typically the person at the panel, no matter how many people you have and no matter how many panels all day, that will sit without any slides, any visuals of any sort, and just talk my way through. Here, it turns out I'm the only person with slides, 3 slides. But that stems out of the discussion that Lisa and I had. I am a senior advisor to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce International Division. I want to make it clear I speak with them, I speak to them, I don't speak for them. But these slides are tracing out of some of the discussions that I've had with folks at the U.S. Chamber. They're consistent with the kinds of trend lines they're looking at as they frame out their responses and their policies. I thought it would be a good way for us to move and transition from the first panel to our discussions by looking at capturing the context around trade, particularly the public resonance, the public reaction to some of the trade issues that are likely to promote themselves. And I really just have the 3 slides here. And these are, as I say, they square up with the kinds of discussions that I've been part of in Washington, but they're drawn from public sources. This is Pew Center for Research for the People and the Press. So I want to credit that particularly, and they're just slightly repurposed so that they just include the relevant information for us. The first question or set of answers is in response to the question, what do you think about increased trade? And the way Pew asked this was to put the question in the form of a number of different countries, a trading bloc or country bloc, the European Union. And you see, I can see it only from an angle here, but Canada, Japan, EU, India, Brazil, Mexico, all command solid majorities in favor of saying more trade would be better with this set of countries, this bloc, the EU. Even in South Korea, it's not a majority, but a plurality. When you look over at the far right, you see China. And even as fraught as that relationship is for the American public right now, it's really neck and neck. It's statistically insignificant. They're even more or less at a draw there. Kirsten, if we can move to the second slide, when you drill down a little deeper, and this slide captures almost a decade. The blue line is, what about free trade agreements in particular? And again, this is not terribly sophisticated. Are they more good than bad? More bad than good is the way the question is assessed. That's a decade-long blue line that indicates they're largely more good than bad. That comes from 1997 all the way through 2007 in the souring of the economy. And perhaps not too surprisingly, perhaps what's surprising is the little 2009 blip that puts the blue above the red, but you can see that we're solidly trending towards these free trade agreements. Generally, trade is good. Generally, we're Adam Smith and Wealth of Nations when we talk about it, but we look down one level to the free trade agreements that are coming down the pike, and we think maybe, as a public, they're more bad than good. They'll do more harm than good. Now, if we can drill down on the third, what about me? A great question for Americans to be put. How does it affect me? And here the question is, again, very broad terms. Will free trade hurt more than it helps, help more than it hurts? And here you see that people, over the last 4 years, and I segmented this out because roughly, if we're looking against the background of the FTAs, the Korean, Panamanian, Colombian FTAs negotiated between the end of 2006 and the midpoint of 2007, the actual negotiations largely being done and completed at that point in time. You see that we think as a public that it hurts more than it helps. And then if you look over on the right side, people were invited to get down even one level more deeply. Does it create jobs or cost jobs? Does it raise wages or lower wages? Does it expedite growth or accelerate growth, or does it slow growth? And you look at the red, you look at the way in which the American public takes a negative view on all of those key indicators. So the more specific you get, the more skeptical and anxious the American population gets about these things. Now, how is that useful for us? I don't know that we would answer these questions in this way, in this room or in our virtual audience, and that's what I want to get at by this. Because it's setting up for me, watching this in Washington, as a kind of a public opinion paradox. The American people have said to Washington that they want to see bipartisan action, an end to partisan rancor, and movement on something that helps push the economy forward and accelerate growth. That's what they want, right? Washington, a consensus, a kind of harmonic convergence is taking place around the Obama administration deciding to move forward with this package of free trade agreements, the Republicans saying they're ready for it, the business community largely, again, it's always hard to just say business community, largely supporting it. Some unions coming off the sidelines and saying we're good with Korea now, right? And ready to move forward. So it's kind of harmonic convergence. So we want, the public says, move forward in some bipartisan way. Washington coalesces in a bipartisan way around trade, and the American people somewhere in 2011 loop back coming into 2012 and say, we didn't mean that issue. We didn't want you to accelerate and move forward on that issue. We're actually unhappy that you move forward on that issue. I can't solve the paradox. I can only say that that's what I see is shaping up. If there's a time, and I truly believe they'll move, Washington's going to move on Korea free trade. I think, as Jennifer said on the first panel, and Tim as well, predicting that those packages will go through. I hope they go through. I'd agree with that. That's where my sentiments would be. I hope they'd go through in 2011 because I can see this getting caught in a whipsaw in 2012 if they don't. Now, so just my last general point would be, elite opinion, we're all baptized inside the elite. We understand there's no reverse gear on globalization, right? There's only way forward. You can refine it, you can make it better, but we don't really think we can, back it up, unring the bell. Whatever cliche you want to choose on this. The American public is not there, right? So we have a situation where we have to be careful that the elites, including us, move forward, but the public is really not giving us much space in which to move. That calls for leadership, that calls for education, and I don't know that it's there yet, and I don't know that it's there in a consistent sort of way. So I'm concerned that our freedom of action is more circumscribed than we might think, and I want to encourage our group to say, have we done what we can to create the space for the positive reforms that I think we'd all agree on? I'm not so sure we have. I don't have an easy answer as to how we do it.
Great. Dan, that's a great transition, kind of taking from the previous panel. I just want to have Dom and Jim, if you had anything, any reaction to the previous panel. And I think just having this sort of divergent points of view, I think they also exist in the business community. It's very important that we kind of address that. But I think the framework of, we're probably not going to rewind the clock here, so unring the bell, I like that. So any thoughts and reactions, Jim?
Yeah, I guess for me, I mean, I really come at it from a pragmatic perspective of, you know, as a business leader, you know, how should I be thinking about this? And my first kind of takeaway from this morning's conversation is the country-specific trade practices, the decisions of the World Trade Organization, they're evolving, they're going to continue to evolve, there are changes there. And as a practitioner, I need to be thinking through how does my organization prepare itself to understand and manage, and to the degree that we can anticipate some of those changes, you know, to make sure that we're as positioned as we can be to, you know, successfully move our business forward. The other takeaway that I had from this morning is that if you look at the policies that are designed around expanding opportunities, so, you know, for the most part, you know, when you refer to the, you know, overall perspectives of this particular group and the folks online, expansion is good, right? I mean, expansion brings new opportunity, it opens up new markets, it provides revenue growth for us and for all of our companies and our shareholders and so forth. But it's also, you know, incredibly fraught with risk. And so the challenge, as I think about it from a pragmatic perspective, is how do we instill in our organizations the discipline and the structure to be able to very efficiently and in an ongoing way manage that tightrope that exists between where do I choose to aggressively go after these opportunities, where do I go after them but have appropriate kind of strategies in place to deal with potential risks and issues that might arise out of them, and where do I choose to step back and say the situation is volatile enough that I should be so cautious that I want to be very deliberate and perhaps hold off a little bit. And so in putting into place in our organizations today kind of the ability to think through that, not just at one-time discrete events, but on an ongoing basis, I think is one of the challenges that we have as business leaders.
Great. Tom, anything to add?
Yeah, just a quick observation on the discussion around trade deficit and value add and what I'll call kind of tracing of material. And speaking for kind of the customs people,
right,
if they're out there, and just felt the cringe of those people as that discussion went on. And as you know, I think a little later we'll talk about some of the free trade agreement issues, which actually require that, knowing where components came from, measuring the value add, probably not to the point that was being brought up earlier, but to some degree, and the complexity of doing that and doing it on a global scale for multiple agreements it is a pretty daunting task for companies. So it was really kind of interesting to hear that as a, you know, kind of trade policy issue, and then how that, you know, would eventually move down to. I did.
Mic on?
Okay, and how that would move down to an actual policy.
Great. I think we're all mic'd up here. Okay, let me follow up, Jim, with a question for you. Mm-hmm. And then Dan, if you could, I'll have you answer from a secondary perspective. But so what do you see as the biggest risk? You know, now put on the Dun & Bradstreet hat, you know, what's the biggest risk from a global trade perspective? And then I'm going to ask you to take your hat off and put your HP hat on. How do you think about that same thing? And I hope it's the same, might not be.
And I don't even look good in hats. So. I guess the first thing I would say, and this is going to sound like stating the obvious, but the first is to acknowledge that these risks exist and that they have the impact, and the impact can be very significant. And that sounds, you know, cliche and kind of commonplace, but when you think, you know, when I was running HP's global PC operation, that wasn't top on my list. It wasn't the primary thing that I was thinking about. And so, you know, just understanding and acknowledging that there is an impact that these issues have on our ability to meet our expectations to our customers and to our shareholders and so forth. If you just look at, you know, what's transpired over the last, you know, few weeks or so in Egypt, I mean, this is, you know, clearly very good relationships between the U.S. government and the Egyptian government. Clearly, a lot of businesses have been doing business in Egypt for a number of years, and so, you know, the changes that have occurred over the last couple of weeks or so are going to, you know, take, you know, some unknown time, but probably on the scale of years to kind of work their way through some of these, you know, systems and the way some of the changes are impacting us from a business perspective. So, you know, the first kind of takeaway is, you know, acknowledging and you know, and understanding that piece of it. The second I would say is to look at the ripple effect. And so if you think about many organizations, it wouldn't be uncommon to say, you know, I've got business in a particular region, I really need to understand the risks associated with that particular region. However, what we have found is that in many cases, issues that start in one region end up causing issues in other regions. And if you're not paying attention to that at a broader scale, you end up getting potentially blindsided by potential issues that weren't really on your radar screen. I mean, if you look at right now what's going on with the refugees from Tunisia, starting to set up shop in this in a tiny little island off of Italy, you've got the Italian government and the refugees reaching out to the broader European community looking for financial support for the settlement and relocation. And so, it wouldn't be at all uncommon for a business leader to say, and it would be a reasonable thing to think about, that I don't have any operations kind of impacted by what's going on by this particular situation, and yet it's happening, on this broader, more global scale that we're talking about, and in fact that may potentially have that impact. I know in my own experience, to put my HP hat on for a minute, when I was running HP's notebook PC operation, we had made the decision to outsource a lot of the manufacturing and ultimately a lot of the design of our notebook PCs to a small handful of companies that exist in Taiwan. Companies that you've probably heard of: Quanta, Compal, Twinhead, some of the major manufacturers. They were looking to grow. They were looking to expand, and obviously, Taiwan is a relatively contained place. They were looking to expand their operations and gradually grow more aggressively in China. So, so all of a sudden, my ability to grow, my ability to meet what is a potential substantial market opportunity for us, is tied to risks that exist between the geopolitical forces of Taiwan and China. And so needing to want to acknowledge that and understand that, and then try to figure out how do I deal with that and how do I anticipate that, and that became one of the core challenges that we needed to work through.
Interesting. Dan, you want to add on the risk
There's
front?
so many different ways. That's fascinating, I think, because in other words, a business decision that HP makes brings you into the Taiwanese market for manufacturing advantages and so on and so forth. And then what you find is you've actually acquired now a strange new interest in political risk and Chiang Kai-shek and the Taiwanese mainland relations and all of that. I mean, you acquire a foreign policy around what began as a business decision. And I'm just struck by how that creates and recreates itself so much of the time. I mean, this is the kind of curse of the just-in-time economy. We're very agile, we move very quickly, but and I guess another idea would be the interconnectedness of things is just astonishing. A small little one, and you probably have noticed it, just on a level of irony, if nothing else. In Libya, people seeking to overthrow their regime are tweeting out using the condenser at Bitly that condenses the URLs for their tweets as they kind of try to coordinate and manage things. I mean, this has been the case, anybody using Twitter anywhere in the Middle East and Northern Africa during this time of ferment. And Bitly, of course, the LY stands for what? The LY is Libya. And in 2007, I checked this out, Bitly bought the suffix LY for $75 so that they could basically, and countries were selling these suffixes, and then you could operate servers and so on. Now it turns out now we need to be interested in whether or not how many servers that Bitly has really power what's going on with the condensing. How many are in Libya? It turns out there's 5 and 2 of them are in Libya, and I hope I'm not getting this wrong. But there's no risk that it's actually going to get taken down. But at the time that decision was made, I'm sure there was a lot of stuff about, we got our domain for $75, from this. Now, nobody was running a check to see how stable that would prove to be. And also just the way that dynamic has rippled, because I thought to myself, is this really what happens around the world in terms of the domain name purchases tied to countries? And Colombia, for instance, sells the .co, but it turns out Colombia sells it for 20% of the revenue attached to the use to which it's put. So they didn't sell it for $75. Those kinds of things. I think this sense that we live in a world where you pull a little bit of the thread and the fabric unravels, that's a small bore, non-consequential, kind of ironic way that it manifests itself. But the bigger issue is, this is happening all the time. Now, I'm coming out of an environment where it's perfectly normal for me to see analysts go on television every day, and you guys see the same ones, and they will argue, both sides of the case. They will say to you on, one day, it is absolutely inconceivable that we will see regime change in country X. They will be on the show the next day and say it was absolutely inevitable that we would see regime change in country X, and they apparently can pull it off. It would be harder for me to do that. But this is happening all the time. It's inconceivable, it's inevitable, and it's really difficult for us. Just before we came up, we were talking about these things. We've seen an unfolding of geopolitical ferment, I'll try to use a neutral term, that starts with an immolation in Tunisia that triggers then an event in Egypt, but along the way has us looking at Bahrain, it has us looking at Yemen. On a daily basis, we're watching these countries go up or down in terms of risk and what will happen. At that point in time, and unless I missed something, were we really looking at Libya at all? It had hopscotch. If we had a map out, we would say, oops, like bypass Libya. Gaddafi he looks like a tough guy. He doesn't look like he's going to brook a lot of nonsense in the streets, and so it's not showing up on the screen. We're worried about oil. We're worried about oil transiting through the Suez Canal. People are running checks to see how much of it comes through and so on and so forth. We're looking at unrest, geopolitical. We're looking at oil impact. We're still not connecting Libya and oil, and whether or not taking 1 or 1.5 million barrels per day out of Libya, what that would do at the larger scale. Now, many, perhaps people who are here, their companies are looking at that, but I'm talking about the public debate. We're just behind. And so this is a teachable moment for me. We are chronically behind. Geopolitical risk is only interesting if you can predict it, if you can be in front of it. We're finding out how seldom that can be. And this isn't new. In a prior life in 1989, I remember registering the speech by Erich Honecker in East Germany talking about the Berlin Wall lasting another 100 years. It lasted probably less than another 100 hours at that time. People of high and low in key government positions and outside, in intelligence communities, they just don't see this happening. Our world is just too interconnected. And so where do I go with that? I'm always interested in how people forecast or model political risk for companies. I can't hear enough about it. I look at things like Intrade, predictive markets. If people put money where their mouths are, does that tell us anything? The other day, you can look at, will Muammar Gaddafi survive and will Colin Firth win Best Actor? I mean, you can go to these sites and things like that, right? That's always fun. My view is unless proven otherwise, I'm very much a skeptic of the model approach. Where does that leave you? I'm more interested in exploring with companies a little State Department, some sort of advisory group that's put together that would say, in an HP context, for instance, we're going into Taiwan, the business case is solid, it's airtight. What politics are we inheriting? Okay, who can tell us about the Kuomintang and the Communist Chinese? Who can tell us about Taiwan? Who can tell us about US policy in the Strait and all of that stuff? And just putting that group together and just letting people talk and listen, and then pulling away what's most relevant to your group. That's about as scientific as I can get. And I think what we're seeing now in this moment, where really, honestly, we just can't predict, and we should admit that to ourselves, what's our workaround? And our workaround, I think, is these ad hoc expert groups, or at least that's kind of where I'm going.
I think with a consulting hat, I'll put a consulting hat on. I think the geopolitical risk is something that I've seen years where it sort of gets, I don't want to use the word blown off, but it sort of gets dismissed as sort of a non-issue. Yeah, there's geopolitical risk. Yeah, Chinese government's communist, and sort of this, okay, but it's been going on and everything's okay. And then we have sort of what we've had this year. We've had that whole sovereign debt crisis, with Ireland and Ireland and Greece and Spain and the whole bit there, and it creates more risk. Don, I'm going to ask you to kind of put on your consultant hat, because I know you've got one, and walk us through, what do you see, give us sort of your sense. What are the 3 biggest risks? I mean, geopolitical, I think we should spend some time on, because I think your points are very well said, that it's hard to predict.
Yeah, I think one, and I'll term it financial, whether it's risk or cost, I think just depends on
That's right.
Which side of the equation you're on. But these agreements we're talking about, the free trade agreements, these moving of facilities, where I'm going to locate my plants, there's a very significant financial cost from those movements of goods, on tracking them, the costs associated with them moving in and out of countries, whether it's the customs duty, the VAT charges, all these indirect costs that impact trade and free trade. And then so managing that cost is one side of it, and then I think the flip side to that is the risk associated with it, of if I get it wrong, what's the cost? What is my cost of compliance, which I think is something, at least from experience, most people don't seem to manage. It's people hear free trade agreement, great, my duty costs go away, what do I need to worry about? And the cost of that, the old, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Well, there's no free trade. It's not free. The cost of managing that trade and tracking those components and that kind of the example that was given before, that's what is done to manage free trade agreements. It's where does every component come from? Getting support for it and track. So that is a huge cost to the organization and a huge risk if it's done wrong. So that's kind of one of those, I think, significant costs and risks that many times are just overlooked because people hear something's free.
Great point. Can you comment on, I know we talked on the phone over, just kind of introduce the supply chain risk, and let's dive a little bit deeper into that, and Jim, then I'll have you kind of follow up on that. You mentioned security, supply chain security?
Yeah, the one of the things we've seen, and I think, sitting in the US, we've seen it both for programs such as CTPAT, Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, since you warned about acronyms before.
That's right, thank you.
Myself on that.
Nicely done.
That one's been here for a little while. We've had some recent changes in the US with advanced notification for trade data, 10+2, for those who deal with it each and every day. But now what we've seen is those have now creeped out to the rest of the world. And they've looked at saying, well, if we're going to impose these levels of security on what comes into the US, why shouldn't I be imposing that on what's coming into Europe? And why shouldn't I want that same information from that US vendor that you want from my European vendor? That seems like a very reasonable request if I'm sitting in Europe. That's what's so unreasonable about that? And what you're starting to see now is and again, back to cost and risk, to me, two sides.
Sure.
The same coin is the cost to companies of managing that, and there the risk is you miss it, forget about penalties, which there are, is the risk is quote, a do not load message, meaning your goods don't get on that ship going to that country for that sale. And I don't care how much of a penalty your government's going to impose, that is a penalty before you even get to a financial penalty. So I think that risk of managing this supply chain is becoming greater and greater, and it's really in its infancy. And again, we've imposed it on people coming in, on the trade coming in, and now we're really seeing it mushroom around the world. So the risk of that is very, very significant to trade not moving.
Great. Jim, just can you comment on sort of the extended supply chain, the time frames, any risk there that you see?
Yeah, let me put my HP hat on, if I will, for a second. So when I joined Hewlett-Packard, I was originally working for an operation that made gas chromatography equipment, mass spectroscopy equipment. The vast majority of my supply chain and the value creation that occurred between the very beginning and my customers was largely under my control. The manufacturing was in my facility, and I bought really tiny things. Screws, nuts, bolts, valves. I did all the assembly, I did all of the testing, and I turned it into what the customer would ultimately pay for. But the predominance of the value creation was mine. If I had an issue, I went downstairs, I mobilized the right team, and I got them together. And I also had a huge amount of lead time between potential issues and the opportunity for those issues to impact my customers, because I had so much. The portion of the lead time, the portion of the cycle time under my control was substantial. When I left Hewlett-Packard, and in the later stages, we were outsourcing more and more, not only to my Tier 1 supply chain, but my Tier 2 and my Tier 3 and Tier 4. So even though in some cases my overall supply chain got longer, the portion that I had direct control over got substantially shorter. And in fact, if I were to flip for a moment from gas chromatographs to laptops, when I joined HP, we designed them, we built them, and it was all in-house. When I left HP, we never touched them. The laptop went directly from partners and suppliers suppliers directly into the hands of corporate resellers and retailers. And so, the requirement for me was how do I anticipate the issues with limited lead time and lead times that are getting shorter and shorter, and then with a set of partners that is now happening over a broader and broader range, and again, particularly in countries that I may not have a lot of experience with. And so relative to both supply chain risks, some of the geopolitical risks, there's no question that there are categories of risk that are just very difficult, if not impossible, to anticipate. Some of them, there's some information you can begin to pull together to at least give you some clues. And as a manufacturing guy, I find that we're a pretty conservative bunch for the most part. There is no perfect information, so can I find a little bit more information that's a little bit better than what I have today? And can I pull some of that stuff together? So if you look at Ireland, for example, between the economic downturn, the access to public financing, the general deteriorating business climate, there were some clues. I know at Dun & Bradstreet we had begun downgrading the situation as far back as 2008. You need to be able to figure out, to your comment, Dom, how can an organization galvanize themselves around bringing in and then doing something with that information? And again, this in the context of, for the most part, historically, that was not my top issue. But it became, as you get rudely awakened time and time again, it became something that we needed to figure out organizationally how to deal with.
And we're going to get to some of that in just a couple minutes. Dan, did you have anything you want to add?
Just maybe a comment building off there. It strikes me, hearing this discussion, how much ends up being hidden in plain view. Once it's revealed, in hindsight, we trace it back, and it seems almost impossible for us to say we didn't see that, or we didn't feel that, or the dots didn't connect for us, because they connect quite easily. And I know that's ex post facto, and that's the way the human mind works. And it's somehow reassuring, I guess, on some level that, now at least we couldn't head it off at the pass. We didn't see it coming, but we can trace it back and we can look at it. We never seem to take that forward in any meaningful way. On the currency side, Jim points to warning signals here and there. In some respects, if you read Michael Lewis's book, there was a small group of people, the counterparties on the subprime, that were one big, massive, the short was a big warning signal. And did we heed it? Well, some people profited from it, but others could have looked at it and examined what's going on there. And they could have done that on the theory, and I'm not at all expert on these things, but they could have done that. When I see concerted, purposeful activity going on in some place that I don't understand, I can make one of two choices. On a very rudimentary level, I can think those people are colossally stupid and don't know what they're doing, or I could size them up and say they went to good schools, they're smart folks. What the heck do they know that I don't know, that we don't know? And just check that out and test that out for a while. All of what you're saying, Jim. But it's really difficult to do. On the currency thing, and I promised I wasn't going to talk about currency, it turns out Chinese currency. I'm going to talk about, I had a meeting around a consulting exercise in Vienna in early 2009, and in a break, I was being harangued by a very smart guy talking about how the US subprime had imploded and it was going to drag down the global economy, and it was tisk, our fault, and so on. You don't want to, it's a pretty big mess. So, I'm not seriously thinking I need to defend against this charge. But I did ask and said, well, do you think were European banks engaged in the same sort of thing? Were Austrian banks engaged in the same sort of thing? No, they weren't. Our regulations are much more strict. Our ethos just doesn't run that way. Unbridled greed is not as big a factor as it is with Americans. You guys have that problem. Turns out, we're days or at most weeks away from an implosion that turns out to have the Austrian banks are loaning in Swiss francs and euros into Eastern European and Central European economies to consumers taking out house loans. They're earning and living in Romanian lei and Hungarian forints, and they're getting these trace amount interest rates that are terribly attractive in Swiss francs and euros. And they're gobbling these things up. And then all of a sudden, what happens to the forint, the lei, versus these other larger currencies? They go out of whack, and it's almost like their mortgages reset like they were adjustable arms. and it blows up all across these economies, right? And they're going into default. So it turns out there was a banking crisis, and smart people
Right.
just still didn't see it, didn't want to believe it. They saw it in the US, but they didn't examine their own situation. It wasn't the same, but it was related. And it, like a wildfire, it hops. It goes from banking, and then it triggers basically the halt to construction in a part of Europe that's heavily dependent on construction. So it jumps to a different industry. Then it dries up government revenues. Then it feeds political unrest. And then they look at all these countries, and they're all cobbled together in these coalitions that start to break and stress and fracture. So it goes from banking to housing to government revenues declining to political unrest. And then finally, this is an area where the Russians are still fretting over having lost this area. And so now they're looking at ways strategically to get involved economically and intervene to take advantage of the chaos and stress. So banking to construction to government revenues to unrest to possible foreign intervention through an economic guise. It all happens in about 5 weeks, 8 weeks.
Right, right.
We're always behind. We just have a very, very hard time understanding how to stay ahead of that curve.
Let me throw out another. So we've got supply chain risk, we've got financial risk, we have geopolitical risk. Dom, you mentioned to me over the phone at one point export risk. Yes. Can you comment on that? Because a lot of folks here think, what's the big deal?
Yeah, and that I think is really more probably true risk from, again, the company side and dealing with government agencies on the licensing that's required for export. And I think what happens, and to some people in the room, this is common sense, but I think back to public at large, thinks, well, that's for the people selling guns and tanks and military aircraft, and it's not. It's for people selling paint, and for people selling a lot of things no one would think ever needs a license. And the risk there as an exporter is very significant. And there I think kind of flipping around what the real risk is, even though there's been some very large penalty cases that have hit the paper, but the real risk there is once a quarter the violators.
There he is.
The violators. Am I coming in and out? The violators for that are published on bottom fold Wall Street Journal, not a place companies like to see their name, and that's a real risk. So we see that in companies managing that every day, and some are as this kind of came up the other day, and actually the follow-up was on my BlackBerry this morning on a client who's going through technology upgrades and then putting in new systems and decided where they were going to house their server without talking to anyone in their organization. And it's like, time out. That server was going to be put in India, and that server was not being put in India for that company. There could not happen. And just some little things like that people make decisions that the implications of sometimes are it's as simple as where my data center is. That sounds like an easy who cares where my data center is? I have good infrastructure and there's a lot of access there, but it's sometimes those risks of what I've exported. Well, you've just exported all your technology by putting a data center in another country. That's the government's view. You've exported your entire technology base.
Interesting.
So it's some of the things, they're counterintuitive, I think, some of the export risk, but huge issues for companies.
Okay, we talk a lot about risk, but we have to also turn to solutions. What are some of the things that innovative companies are doing to either mitigate, decrease, whatever you want to call it, on the risk side? So Jim, I'm going to move this question to you. Mm-hmm. Based upon your HP experience, how do businesses think about regions and countries and their relative stability? I think to Dan's point, how do we begin to look at this before it happens instead of our rearview mirror, so to speak? How do you guys look at that and also from a D&B standpoint?
Yeah, I guess the way I tend to think about this topic in general is from a kind of an enterprise class risk perspective. So from a company perspective, what are all of the potential categories of risk that could sink my company? And so there are categories of risk today that organizations have been focused on and have mechanisms in place, and there are processes there to be able to understand and manage and mitigate that risk. For example, commercial credit risk. I mean, it's been around for years, the discipline of I need to understand and make decisions around, do I extend a customer or a potential customer credit? Yes or no? And if so, I'm going to send them credit, how much? I mean, those are pretty well established, and most major organizations have processes in place for doing that. If you think about more on the supply side, it's much, much more embryonic for many companies in terms of the processes that are in place, the organization that's in place. Bill had talked a little bit earlier about some of the skills that exist of some of the people in the organization. I mean, if you think about who within my organization should have responsibility for understanding this new category of risk that has the potential to sink the company? I mean, is that the chief procurement officer? Some organizations create a chief risk officer. Is it someone within a finance organization? Those are things that we're still struggling as an industry to kind of sort out. Which roles within the company? I mean, if you think about the buying community and the commodity management community, historically, going back years, that group of people is there to make sure that the line doesn't get shut down. Mm-hmm. And then over the last several years, it's been much more about, and we can strategically help reduce cost. Okay, well, you've got a group of folks that are now trained and skilled at taking out cost, but I don't think they've made the leap, Dom, that you've described a couple of times, which is risk is really just an element of cost, but the risk isn't a factor in the equation when they're thinking about this overall cost. So how do they kind of take that into account? This whole kind of category is just very, very new for most companies. And yet, so I was working with a company not too long ago, major diversified multi-billion-dollar company. They have some equipment that they make that has transmissions that are sole sourced with a company that's in Brazil that happens to be unionized. And they're at the risk of, at any point in time, should that union have, issues and, any kind of work stoppage, it could sink the company because of the magnitude. The ability for them to quickly resource that is not there. And so as a result, if there's any disruption to that supply in the just-in-time where I can't afford anymore to have substantial amounts of inventory in the system as a vehicle for buffer, what can I do? And so kind of thinking some of those things through. Again, with my experience at HP, we had a situation where I'm buying from the ODMs that I'd set up these relationships with in Taiwan. Well, I get a phone call from the ODM, and the ODM says, I'm sorry to tell you, Mr. Lawton, but unfortunately, we're not going to be able to make your shipments that are coming up on such and such a date of big magnitudes because our supplier is not able to provide you with batteries. Now, I see a bunch of you got laptops up today. I don't know how many you're going to buy these laptops if you don't have batteries in them. So right now, I have millions of dollars of my revenue that is at risk as a result of these risks that are sitting with companies that they're not on my vendor master. I don't buy from them. I don't have a contract with them. In many cases, I don't even know who they are. Right? I mean, you'd be surprised at how many companies find out that in many cases, the company to whom they've outsourced has also done some outsourcing, and it may not even be a part in a region of the world that you would expect. So, we worked with a major high-tech company that they had outsourced something to China. The Chinese manufacturer had turned around and outsourced it to a company that was in sub-Saharan Africa. We're talking to our client, and they're like, I didn't even know I had any business going on. Well, you don't really. But are you impacted by it? Absolutely, because if the Chinese guy can't get it from this company in Africa, then you're in trouble. And so, thinking through for companies, what is the right way to kind of get as much information as I can from a Dun & Bradstreet perspective. I mean, we have a database of 191 million companies around the world. 15 to 20 million of that has come all in the last 12 months and all in China and India. So I mean, the places where people are interested in understanding more about where these potential sources of both supplier risk and then regional risk, we need to just supply ourselves with more and more information around how do we anticipate to the degree that we can and prepare ourselves for these issues that are going to occur for many companies.
Well, that's great, very insightful. Dom, I'm going to call this and have you comment on what I call the Rio Tinto scare for those of you that followed that story. Some I won't say steel executives, raw material mining company, Rio Tinto, their Chinese CEO based in Shanghai was arrested, detained, and I think he's still in jail, to be honest. How, that's a risk. I mean, you mentioned you've seen that before. How does somebody manage the Rio Tinto risk, if you will?
Yeah, and it's interesting when we talked about it, kind of, I guess, how different parts of the organization look at it. And this was at a client. This was within the last, probably the last 2 to 3 weeks. And one of their ways to manage it is their CEO for their Chinese operations sits in Japan. And that's how they manage their risk. And I guess that's okay for the CEO who sits in Japan. I don't know if it's okay for all the other people who may report to the CEO that sit in China. And what their thought on that may be, but it was just kind of almost a tongue-in-cheek of, well, that's okay, but what about the risk in the entity? And I think really where it came down to, and not to pick on China, we could say the same thing about Russia and a number of other countries, where I think it's the combination of how transparent are the rules, right? So what are my rules, so I know what my obligations are. That's one issue. And then the other piece of it is the enforcement of the rules, the appeals process, be it administrative and judicial, where in many of these countries, those things don't exist. And that's where I think that risk really highlights itself of, even if you're trying to comply, if the rules are not real transparent and there's no administrative review process, the judicial processes don't exist, it's pretty hard to really manage your risk outside of just throwing bodies and resources at trying to comply, and hopefully it doesn't explode.
Let me throw out one more question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience for the last 10 to 15 minutes. So Jim, let me throw this one out to you. What do you see as some of the strategies and tactics for mitigating the risks posed by some of these non-financial factors? So we talked about climate change ever so briefly, socioeconomic factors, the geopolitical. What are the tools in the toolbox, if you will?
My general perspective on this and advice to companies that I talk with, probably the most important thing is to define and implement a process that's going to be reasonable for your organization. And so what I tend to find in most companies, 80% of them have no process at all. 10% of them maybe have something, but it's not really implemented. It's PowerPoint ware. And the other 10% have gone to the other end of the extreme, and they've defined something so complex and so resource intensive that it can't be executed, and so it never does. Which, if I've done my math right, leaves just about nobody that's got this issue under control. There are good companies doing good things, but it really comes down to define a process that can work in the context of your organization with the resources that you're prepared to put into it. Make sure you understand organizational responsibility, skills, and the people that are going to be driving on this process. And the key disciplines in that process need to include a certification program for companies that you're doing business with, and not just an initial one. So on the sourcing side, many of our organizations do elaborate sourcing exercises, and then that's it. So the recertification is in many cases just as important as the certification. Second is the monitoring of those companies and those regions on an ongoing basis. So how can I become aware in the situations where I think I need to be paying attention, and again, recognizing that probably 80% of them I just want to become aware of, but I'm not going to choose to do anything. But how can I bubble that information up in an efficient manner to only put on the radar screen those things that I should be spending time thinking about? And there's a lot in that in terms of getting that to work efficiently. So again, in my life running procurement organizations for Hewlett-Packard, I have no shortage of systems providing me long lists of things that I need to be paying attention to. I mean, if you just take the day in the life of the buyer, they walk in and they get an exception report. Here's all the crap that if you don't do something about today, you're going to have a problem. So where do I start? And so there's some science, but there's some art that needs to go into thinking about how do I focus myself on those key areas. And then the last discipline that needs to be there is, well, what are you going to do about it? And so how do you make the decisions around, when do you bubble it up, to what level, what are the right mitigation strategies to have in place, and then being prepared to execute on those strategies. strategies. I mean, the fortunate aspect of a lot of what leaders have done from a supply chain and a procurement and a sourcing perspective over the last 5 years has been drive it to be a competitive way in which businesses can succeed. So if you come back to kind of my notebook PC operation, there was a very long period of time where HP could afford to charge premiums on notebooks, because it wasn't the Apple logo or it wasn't the Dell logo, but because it was the HP logo. The reality is so many of our notebooks are coming from some common places that it became harder and harder for me to distinguish, and so my ability to charge a premium came down substantially, which means now I'm competing in many cases on price. The old MIPS per dollar kind of, time frame, kind of context. Well, if I've got a cost structure that looks substantially worse than my competitors, I'm going to be hard pressed to both maintain my margin expectations and compete on price. So I need to have a more efficient supply chain. So I've done all of these things in terms of, making my supply chain, much more efficient. But that has brought this new categories of risk. And so instilling these kind of disciplines in an organization becomes, I can't go backwards. I can't add all that additional inventory. I can't add the extra lead time. I can't blossom out into lots of different companies and have them all in the ready all the time. I need to be very selective about all of those things, but I need to be prepared to figure out when do I deploy them, and what do I do, and how do I do it as efficiently as possible.
Great. Should we open it up for questions here in the audience? And then I know there's a lot of folks in the risk management world here, software and whatnot side, so hopefully you're not too shy to ask a question, and then we can come back to the panel. Anyone? Very shy audience this morning. Go ahead, Jason, thanks.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Really great discussion so far.
I think it's off.
We're on here.
Is the mic on? There we go.
Mike, great. Jim, I think you raise a fascinating point when you note the changing skill set in procurement. If you look at keeping the line up historically, that was kind of a risk management function. But as we've all seen in the past 10 years, if our role in procurement now is to reduce costs, where has that skill set gone? And then if I look at Dom's points, especially on the global trade, the import-export front, and Don's points, in North Africa, especially in Libya, I'm just struck by the fact, not only do we not necessarily have the right skill set. Are you being sick? Are we on here? Should I repeat the question?
Well, then why is it on here?
Are we on the mic here? Little tech problem. Yeah, we're going to repeat. Go ahead.
I will repeat the question.
No, we'll repeat it, so you go ahead and keep asking.
So I'm struck by the fact, not only do we not necessarily have the right skill sets anymore, we've lost skill sets, and then at the same time, what we do have seems spread across different functions and roles. So how do we bridge that gap?
Okay, let me summarize the question. I think it was, sorry, we had some technical glitches here on the mic, and a rather lengthy question, which I'm going to shorten into. We've had a skill change from when our biggest crisis from a risk perspective was just keep my line running to, my gosh, I have to look at geopolitical risk and supply chain risk and export, reputational risk and intellectual property risk and currency risk. Kind of, what do we need to bridge that gap? Is that it? Do I have that? Okay, thank you. Jim or Dom, you guys want to take a pass at that?
I'll take a quick cut at it. I think from one of the things I see is really more collaboration within the organization, because I think what happens is that there is no one person that's going to do that. There's a team of people, each have their own expertise now. I think one of the issues is, that we've gotten funneled. It's gotten so complex that you can't go this way anymore. Everyone's going this way. So I think it's making sure that there's the right collaboration tools, the right people are sitting at the table when those decisions are being made, and as they're evaluating what they're doing so that they get the right input. I think, the old, I can make that procurement decision and I really don't need to talk to 3, 4, 5 other people. Those days are gone. And it really does need a team effort, I think.
Jim, anything to add?
Yeah, and I think that's fair to say. I guess the only thing I would add to it is, well, in my experience, I find that most organizations have someone somewhere that kind of sees the issue and then stands up and says, look, I'm going to be the champion, I'm going to be the person that kind of drives that. And in my experience, again, coming back to my comments about this is still relatively embryonic, I can't say that it's always the chief procurement officer, it's always the chief financial officer. It does vary quite a bit, and I think it'll continue to vary probably for the next several years until, as a kind of a industry organizational perspective, we sort some of these things out. And I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing, at this point. I think it's just a matter of someone saying, look, we need to do some of these things differently. This is much more interconnected than perhaps we had originally envisioned. Risk and cost are not separate, and in fact, they're the same thing. We need to be thinking about them that way. The decisions that we're making from a design perspective and from a sourcing perspective and from a manufacturing perspective are all tied together with one another. But I think it really does come down to who's got the insight in terms of the issue and the aggressive pursuit of wanting to do something different inside a company. Even if that means, let's run an experiment, let's design something, put it in place, and iterate as we go. Because for most companies, the be all end all. I mean, if I had the magic process I could hand you, I would, but it doesn't exist. So it becomes very people dependent and leadership dependent.
Any other couple more questions back here?
I was very intrigued with some of Dan's comments about predictive markets, and you talked about risk management and how different organizations address that. So the question is addressed to all three panelists. If you were to benchmark people that do risk management well, what are the names that rise to the surface? I mean, who are the people that do it really well?
Anyone want to take that one?
I'm going to, like in a poker game, I'm going to take that, but I'm going to pass. But I do want to I want to answer a different question in that. Who does it well? Jim made the point, it's art and science. I mean, I think we want the science. Science is often in short supply. That leaves us with art. It's less satisfying, but maybe it is what it is. If I answer that question, I'm going to fall off the tightrope on one side or another relative to clients and so on. But I feel like I've been deficient on the solution side, and let me just put that out in the conversation, defining how difficult it is. Again, the whole value is predictive. If it's not predictive, then it's all just game playing and hindsight and write a paper on what happened and post-mortem mode. But on the solution side, and I spend a lot of my time working with companies in the resource sector, and that's got its pluses and its minuses. It's got its minuses, and so they're after a thing in the ground, and it's in the ground where it's in the ground, and it happens to have a country drawn around it, and you have to get mother may I, can we extract it and take it out? Well, unlike a lot of other companies, it doesn't mean that they can look and say, well, we're going to move to Taiwan because the costs are better. I mean, and so that is often seen as a limiting factor. Woe is me, we're stuck, what do we do? My mind is, again, it is what it is. So how it concentrates the mind. It actually, once you look at it that way, it simplifies things. You have to get right from a resource development perspective with the country in which you operate. And if it's also part of a larger, if it's a European country that's in the EU with the supranational entity of which it's part. So it gets a little more complicated. But it concentrates the mind. My exercise is, can you move around to the side of the table where the political officials and the public policy officials and the regulatory officials sit? And can you look at your situation from their point of view? They want to try to make progress of a certain sort in their country. How does your project show up and advance that or hinder that or not play a part in that? So I'm looking at ways to mitigate policy and policy risk, political risk, but I kind of call it policy risk, right? And then, 3 acronyms: CSR, SD, and UN. The UN stands for United Nations. And I want to shout out, because I know somebody's on the line in the virtual space with United Nations. Corporate social responsibility, sustainable development. The UN has this thing called the Global Compact. Many of you are probably very well aware of that. That assesses companies from an environmental, labor, human relations standpoint, transparency and anti-corruption efforts, and so on. Those types of things as risk mitigation factors, I want to be on the solution side a little bit. Those kinds of things are quite useful. If I see, sometimes companies aren't doing much of them at all. Most times these days, companies are doing something, but they understand it as a kind of philanthropy. They understand it as a kind of foundation exercise that they do. I'm talking about something a little different, integrating it really much more closely in terms of trying to advance the projects and prospects of any given company. And therefore, that CSR SD effort isn't off the shelf. It really needs to be calibrated to the place that you're trying to do work. And it has to be framed by going around, sitting on that side of the table and looking at it from a public official's standpoint, who is really the gating guy to your project. He lets it go forward, he stops it. He lets it go fast, or it goes really slow, and we're talking years. All the costs attendant on that. If you look at it that way, you're ready to make more of an investment in some of the CSR ideas, some of the sustainable development ideas, and really make them fit the place where you're operating. Really create a value. And then, you can't guard against the unforeseen. But when the unforeseen comes, your company would present as a company that's trying to help the government go in the positive direction. And at least you'd have that. And in such a topsy-turvy world, I'm trying to find something some little island of stability, and I think that's kind of where I try to build. So I'm sorry I didn't answer a rating in terms of who's up and who's down in the space, but I try to give you a sense of like what do I think is valuable.
Jim and Dom, do you have any thoughts on, are we able to disclose anybody that you guys out in the, that's going to be a big no.
We're both looking at each other.
That's a pretty tough one.
Yeah, these guys are great at it.
I think it's back to, without names, I think it's, if you look at some of the issues we're talking about, it's that profile of the ones who've acknowledged it's an issue, which is not everyone, and then putting things in place to try to deal with some of these things. They've acknowledged it, they've got some process around it, how to deal with the issues. They can demonstrate that case of, they're working with governments on some of the, the security issues in these things in voluntary programs. So I think you could see some profiles of people who are, trying to do it and do it well, and help themselves at the same time, right? Because if you're part of those programs, you're helping create the requirements. It's a lot easier to create the requirement than to have it, shoved down your throat, basically.
Exactly.
So it helps them and helps others in the business as well.
Jim, you have any closing remarks?
Yeah, I guess if I could tease apart, if you'd allow me a little bit, between clients, who I won't talk about, but just things that I've seen in terms of, just interesting work that's been going on. I think Hewlett-Packard does some phenomenal stuff, so I'll mention Hewlett-Packard, of course. Cisco Systems has been doing some really interesting things around enterprise risk. Companies like Dresser Ran, United Technologies, again, I think have done some, some pretty powerful things. Polycom, based out on the West Coast, have struggled with and have put in place some, interesting programs for how they've, and they would most likely be the first, and in some of the presentations I've seen, be the first to acknowledge it's not the be-all, end-all. But again, my view in general, coming back to my earlier comment about, a bunch of us tend to be pretty risk averse by nature. I don't want some big galactic program, because some big galactic program isn't going to work. So what I want is something today that's a little bit better than what I had yesterday, and something tomorrow that's a little bit better than what I have today. And I think some of those companies I just described have done a really good job kind of stepping their way in a very positive direction.
Terrific. Well, I think we are about out of time. I'm sorry. If you have some follow-up questions, we'll catch folks in between. Actually, there is no in between. We're going direct to the next panel afterwards. I want to thank all of you. There are 3 speakers here, Dom, Jim, and Dan, for your time. I think it was an interesting conversation.
Thank you.